Somehow, everything feels more manageable when there's a plan. From the outside, it can look like discipline, being health conscious, organized, maybe even incredibly well put together. But inside, you feel wired, exhausted, but you can't switch off. And whenever something feels uncomfortable, the answer somehow always seems to be do something. And that's what I call the fix-it loop. It's what can happen when behaviors that genuinely look healthy, disciplined, or productive also become ways of managing or avoiding uncomfortable emotions, or more precisely, uncomfortable internal states. And that brings us to something at the heart of the fix-it loop, emotion regulation. By the end of this video, I'm going to show you how to spot your own fix-it loop and how to begin creating other options without giving up the things that genuinely support you. I first began noticing this in myself, and then I saw it happen over and over again in the clients I worked with throughout the years. So to begin, what do I actually mean when I say emotion regulation? Put simply, it's how we respond to and work with our emotions and internal experiences. And nervous system regulation is part of that bigger picture, how our bodies respond and adjust as we move through different demands. Sometimes that means our system becomes more activated. And when I use that word, I simply mean more mobilized and ready to respond. You might notice you're activated when some or all of these things occur. Your attention may sharpen. Your heart rate might increase. You might feel more alert or energized. None of these are necessarily a problem. In fact, activation is normal and a necessary part of being human. We need some activation to exercise, to concentrate, to respond to pressure, to have a difficult conversation. Which is why one of the biggest misunderstandings about regulation is the idea that being emotionally regulated means being calm. It doesn't. And just to add, regulation itself isn't really the end goal either. The end goal is emotional resilience. And by resilience, I know this is a lot of definitions, but it's important. And by resilience, I don't mean being so tough that nothing bothers you. I mean being able to experience emotion, discomfort, and the inevitable demands of life, while still having some flexibility in being able to choose how we respond, adapt, and reorient when things change. Because let's face it, life is always changing. And this is really important for the fix-it loop, because activation doesn't necessarily feel bad. A lot of people associate it with anxiety, but sometimes it feels like focus, energy, drive, productivity. It's that feeling about, yes, I'm getting things done. There have been several periods in my own life when that highly activated state felt like the best version of me. I remember feeling productive, having energy, and getting things done. And because I was productive, I didn't necessarily recognize it at the time as stress until I couldn't sustain it. Doing can sometimes feel incredibly rewarding because now your attention has somewhere else to go. And if you're feeling discomfort, that can feel like a form of relief, or at least reprieve, because you have an action, a direction, or plan. Which brings us back to emotional resilience. The question isn't simply, am I activated? A more useful question is, when something uncomfortable is happening, how much flexibility do I still have to choose a response? We can handle enormous amounts of activation, pressure, and demand, but still have surprisingly little room to respond differently. And I know this one personally as well. There was a time when I was managing an enormous workload, keeping a rigid fitness schedule going, although at the time I wouldn't have called it rigid. I was keeping everything together. I was organized, at least for me, and at the same time had a lot of difficult family matters happening. But when plans would change and I couldn't exercise, I became incredibly anxious and overwhelmed. And let's just say not pleasant to be around. From the outside, you could look at me and think, she can handle an enormous amount. Look at everything she's managing. But what I had much less capacity for was tolerating how I felt when I couldn't exercise. And when I say capacity, that's what I mean here, our ability to tolerate how we feel. I wasn't simply missing a workout. I was having to experience the anxiety and overwhelm that arose when I couldn't work out to manage it. And that's an example of when flexibility could narrow. Because instead of having several possible ways to respond, it would begin to feel like there was only one: exercise. So other ways of coping when completely out the window. All I could focus on at that time was the one thing I couldn't do. And this is where capacity becomes really important. I'm talking about how much can be happening inside before that flexibility starts to narrow. How much emotion, sensation, activation, or demand can a person experience while still having room in choosing how to respond? That's the relationship between capacity and flexibility. And if that's still not clear, we're still unpacking this, so stay with me. So sometimes something else can change too, how strongly we respond in the first place. Have you ever noticed that something you could tolerate relatively well at one point can suddenly feel enormous and impossible at another time? Imagine someone you care about seems a little off with you. Maybe their message is shorter than usual, or their tone feels different. And you find yourself wondering, are they angry with me? And one time you might notice that thought and feel a little uncomfortable and then just carry on with your day. But at another time, that response can feel much bigger. Suddenly you're anxious. You're replaying the last conversation. You're checking your phone. You're trying to work out what you might have done wrong. The situation may not be dramatically different, but the intensity of your response is. And there's a concept that can help us think about this: sensitization. You'll hear this term particularly in pain science. I'm borrowing the concept because it helps to illustrate something useful. Our responsiveness can become heightened. So let's use that message as an example. Someone sends you a shorter message than usual. Maybe there's a little flicker of, are they annoyed with me? Your response rises, but then it settles. You get on with your day. But here, the same short message is accompanied by a much bigger response. Your anxiety shoots up. Are they angry with me? Have I done something wrong? And instead of settling relatively quickly, the response stays elevated for longer. Similar situation, very different intensity of response. That's the piece I want you to notice. But now notice something else. The short message is actually what happened. They're angry with me is what I think it means. And that brings us to another really important part of this: interpretation. The what have I decided this means part. Remember, what actually happened was somebody sent me a shorter message than usual. That's the information I have. But almost immediately, my mind might add, they're angry with me, or I've done something wrong that they're upset with me. And those aren't actually the same thing. One is what happened. The other is the meaning I've given to what happened. That's what I mean by interpretation. And we do this all the time. Something happens inside us or around us, and very quickly, often without even realizing it, we decide what it means. And that's really significant because the meaning we give an experience can influence what we feel and think and believe, what options we even consider available to us, and ultimately what we decide to do. And we can see this in all sorts of situations. I'm exhausted can become I'm lazy. My body feels uncomfortable can become something's wrong with me. Or someone seems a little distant can become I've done something wrong. They're mad at me. Once I've decided what something means, that interpretation can start pointing me toward what I think I need to do about it. So if I'm exhausted means I'm lazy, then maybe I push harder. My body feels uncomfortable means there's something wrong with my body. Then maybe I change my food, check my body, or exercise. And if someone is upset with me means I need to make it be okay, that could mean explaining, apologizing, checking in with them, seeking reassurance, people pleasing, anything to fix it. And the faster and more familiar that connection becomes, and more often I practice it, the less it can feel like I'm making a choice. Something feels wrong, I decide what it means, and almost immediately, I know what I need to do, the familiar thing. So remember that more response we started with. Now we're beginning to see what can be happening underneath it. And that brings us back to the fix-it loop. We have in the fix-it loop experience, interpretation, urgency, familiar response, relief. Something begins to happen inside of me. That's the experience, and it feels uncomfortable. Then I give that experience meaning. That's the interpretation. Maybe it means I'm lazy, something's wrong, I'm losing control. And that interpretation can create a sense of urgency, an urge that I need to fix this. So I reach for a familiar response. Maybe it's exercise or a restrictive diet, or I check or research to ease my sense of doubt, or I organize to get a sense of control back. But in any event, I'm pushing harder. And quite often, I experience a sense of relief, maybe only temporarily, but suddenly I have a plan. I'm doing something. I feel a little more in control. And that relief is really important because when something reduces discomfort, even temporarily, we become way more likely to use that response again and again and again until the distance between something feels uncomfortable and I need to fix something can become incredibly short. And eventually, it may not even feel like a choice at all. It can simply feel like this is what I need to do. Remember my exercise example? That's the fix it loop. And this is how people can become caught in patterns around wellness, productivity, exercise, or self improvement without necessarily realizing they're even caught. Because from the outside, the behavior may still look perfectly healthy. We may even be receiving positive feedback for being so disciplined, organized, and well put together, while on the inside, we're feeling incredibly anxious, overwhelmed, and much less flexible than we appear. And this is probably one of the most important distinctions in this whole conversation. Sometimes the behavior everyone is focused on changing isn't actually the most useful place to begin. When we become curious about what function that behavior is serving, what it's helping someone to manage, avoid, control, or tolerate, suddenly we have somewhere very different to work from. Because two people can do exactly the same healthy thing for completely different reasons. So two people can do the same workout. One might be thinking, because I love feeling strong, training is important to me. And another may be experiencing, I can't tolerate how I'm going to feel if I don't do this. Same behavior, very different function. And the same thing can happen with planning. A plan can genuinely make my life easier, but there's a difference between this plan helps me organize my time and I can't tolerate what I feel when the plan changes. And sometimes it's both. That's why this is all nuanced. The goal isn't to label everything we do as healthy or unhealthy. It's to become curious about what this behavior is doing for me. And in particular, what happens when I can't do it? Because that can tell us an enormous amount. But like with everything, knowing this intellectually isn't necessarily enough, because when that familiar discomfort appears and everything in you is saying do something, that's where we bring in today's healing pivot. And I want to be really careful here because the last thing I want you to do is leave this video thinking, great, now I have another thing I need to get right. Because then we just turned healing pivots into another version of more. And that's the exact opposite of what I'm trying to do for you. Remember, healing pivots are small intentional changes in direction that interrupt a familiar pattern to give us opportunities to practice responding differently. And there are three parts to it: notice, name, choose. So first we notice what's happening. Before you fix anything, what are you actually experiencing? Maybe I notice I'm anxious or angry or exhausted, or my stomach feels uncomfortable. Or maybe I don't actually know what I'm feeling. I just know that something feels off. That's enough. I don't want emotional awareness to become another test that we have to pass. We're simply noticing what's already here. When we're trying to heal or simply feel bad and want to feel better, we can put ourselves under enormous pressure when we already feel pressure. So you're not trying to solve the experience. You're simply beginning by noticing what's there. Next, we name. What am I making it mean? What story or meaning have I attached to what I've just noticed? So I'm exhausted can become I'm lazy. My body feels uncomfortable can become there's something wrong with my body. Someone seems distant has become I've done something wrong. And then we ask, is that the only possible explanation? Because if there could be another explanation, there may also be another possible response. And that brings us to number 3, choose. What choices are actually available to me right now? Maybe I still choose the workout. Maybe I shorten it. Maybe I decide that today I need to rest. Or maybe instead of immediately changing my food, my routine, or my entire plan, I leave it alone for the moment. Maybe I reach out to someone rather than trying to manage everything by myself. Or maybe I don't actually need to do anything about this feeling right now. Maybe I can allow it to be there and continue on with my day. A healing pivot is creating enough space between what I experience and what I automatically do next to see if there's another option. Oh, and remember, the familiar option may still be the one you most want to choose. And that totally makes sense because it's familiar and it may have brought relief so many times before. Perhaps then the question becomes, which one gives me the opportunity to practice more flexibility? And this is what we're ultimately working towards: emotional resilience, that capacity to experience the full range of what it means to be human, the emotion, the discomfort, the uncertainty, the inevitable demands of life, while still having the flexibility to respond, adapt, and reorient when things change. Sometimes resilience means taking action, and sometimes it means just being able to tolerate without immediately needing to change or get rid of the feeling. We're not trying to be unaffected by life. There's often a gap between the life we long for and the patterns we keep repeating. And sometimes that gap is only a few seconds long. Now, there's one more piece in this that we need to talk about, because you might be listening to all of this thinking, okay, Kielty, but what if slowing down actually makes me feel worse? What if you finally take that time off and you can't settle, or you try to rest and you become restless and you finally have nothing to do, and suddenly what was happening inside you becomes much more available or obvious to your attention? Maybe that's a physical discomfort, anxiety, guilt, regret, loss. Maybe it's something you can't even name yet. That doesn't automatically mean you're bad at regulating yourself. And it doesn't necessarily mean that rest or self-care doesn't work for you. There may be something much more interesting going on, and that's what we're going to talk about in the next Healing Pivots video: why slowing down initially can feel so uncomfortable. So subscribe if you want to continue this conversation with me, and I would love to hear from you in the comments. Where do you notice your own fix-it loop? When something feels uncomfortable, what's the thing you immediately feel you need to do? And if there's something within emotion regulation, nervous system regulation, or anything within this whole person approach to healing you'd like me to cover in the future, I would love to hear that. And if you want to go a little deeper, I put a link to my free whole person healing spectrum guide below. So until next time, notice, name, choose, one healing pivot at a time.